Welcome to the cmic3 video, Unit 6 test. We're on our second test. This isn't for the test, but we're on our second test. It is graphing sines and cosines. I'm going to start and do that. I'll do problem 1, let you do problem 2. I'll do a piece of problem 1, you can do a piece of problem 2, and so forth. So we'll do it in phases. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is draw my unit circle, because I'm going to need sine and cosine of various values for all of these problems. So I start with a unit circle, and this is something you can do anytime you do a test. I'm going to label the axes A and B so that they don't have anything to do with the x and y that we're graphing in our problem. It's just a general unit circle. Unit circle means the radius equals 1. So at this point is 1, because my radius would be down here too. My radius would continue up here. This is a radius. So this is positive 1. This value would be a equals negative 1. And this value would be b equals negative 1. If I remember SOHCAHTOA, I know my a value. So for this point, a is this distance, and b is this distance. So for any point I have a and b, opposite over the adjacent is b over 1. So I know that b is the same as my sine. And I'll put my x down here, and that's the only relationship to the problems we're working on. That's the x value that we're going to be graphing. So sine of x is my b value, and cosine of x, the adjacent over the hypotenuse, is my a value. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to put that in. So cosine is the a value. A here is 1. This is 1. So at this point, where x is 0, cosine equals 1. Sine of x equals 0, because sine of x is the b value. B is 0 here. If I go around here, b is now 1, a is 0, so cosine is cosine is 0. My a value is now 0, my b value is now 1. And I'm going to continue around here. I'm going to continue making right here my x is 90 degrees, or pi over 2 radians. So x will be pi over 2. I come around here, x will have gone 180 degrees, or pi radians. And my y value here at this point is, my b value is 0. So my sine is 0. And my a value is negative 1. So my cosine equals negative 1. And I follow that on around to 270 degrees, or pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. And at this point, if x is 3 pi over 2, I can label that with my a value, which is, a is now 0 again. So cosine of x equals 0. And sine of x is my b value, which is 1. So sine of x equals 0. And then I go on around to 2 pi, which is exactly the same place as 0 radians, where I started. When x was 0, cosine of x is 1, sine of x is 0. That's true of 2 pi also. So I got my unit circle. I can use that to do my graphs. First of all, though, if I'm graphing the first one, I look for my amplitude. Amplitude I get from the number that's next to the sign, so my amplitude is 4. Vertical shift, I look for a number that's added. In this case, I don't have anything added, so really it's like plus 0. There is no vertical shift here. Period is the length of time that it takes for the sine to go through one cycle in this case. When I have sine of x, it takes 2 pi radians to go through a complete cycle. It starts at 0, sine starts at 0, goes to 1, back to 0, down to -1, back to 0, and it's ready to start over again. So the period is 2 pi. Pause the video really quickly now. Move on to problem 2. See if you can find the amplitude, vertical shift, and period in problem number 2. Okay. I'm sure that you found that the amplitude was 3, because this number multiplied by sine is 3. Once again, I have no vertical shift because it's really plus 0. There's nothing added. And the period is, once again, 2 pi, because x is by itself. Okay. Now I'm going to graph problem 1. I'm going to take that information and put it on my graph. So first of all, my amplitude goes to 4, and I have no vertical shift. So I am going to go from 1 to 4 on my vertical axis, which is y. And I look at my period. I want to have 2 complete cycles. So my period, when I'm halfway through my graph, I want to be through a full cycle. So I'll go through one period, so I'll go 0 to 2 pi. That means the rest of the graph will be 4 pi. For half a cycle would be half of 2 pi, or pi. And a fourth of a cycle would be pi over 2. So this would be pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, 6 pi over 2, which would be 3 pi, and then 7 pi over 2. As far as my graph, now I'm going to look at plotting my points. So I'll start with 0. If sine of 0 is, from my unit circle, sine of 0 is 0. So I start at 0. I go to pi over 2. So that's where the Ferris wheel is up at the top. Sine is equal to 1. My formula says take 1 times 4. So here I will go up to 4 at pi over 2. Back to pi over, or not pi over 2, but just pi. At pi, sine is back to 0, because sine is my vertical again. So I'm back to 0 here. 3 pi over 2 on my unit circle, I'm down to -1, sine, to 0. So sine of x is 0. Oops. Sorry, I wrote that wrong on my unit circle. Sine is the b value, so the sine is 1. -1, because I am down below. So I go -1 on my sine, I multiply by 4. I'm down at -4. And I go back to 0 at 2 pi on my unit circle. I've established a trend now, so I'm just going to follow that through. I could make that argument for each of the other points, but I know I'm just rotating a Ferris wheel. I'm going to go up and down. And I just draw a smooth curve through it. It doesn't have to be perfect, just to get the idea. And then I look at negative. So negative pi, negative 2 pi, negative 3 pi, and negative 4 pi. I'm going to extend that pattern backwards. So I'm going to be going down to negative 1. I'm sorry, the sign would go to negative 1. 4 times the sign will go to negative 4. Negative pi and back to 0. Okay. See if you can graph this problem now. Pause the video for a moment, see what you can do, and then come back and check. Okay, now that you've graphed it, let's see if you did it the same way that I did. 2 pi, once again, is my period. Pi over 2. Okay, oh, sorry. Half of 2 pi is pi. This then would be 3 pi and 4 pi. And I'm just going to remember that this is halfway in between. So, once again, since it's sine, I start at 0. On my unit circle, sine starts at 0 when x is 0. It goes up to 1 at x equals pi over 2. If I do sine of 1, sine of pi over 2, I get 1 times 3 is 3. So here I'm going to go up to 3. And I can go by one on my vertical axis. Go up to 3, back to 0 at pi, because my vertical value, my b, is back to 0. And then down to negative 1, which when I multiply by 3 will give me negative 3, back to 0. And I've completed a cycle, so I follow that pattern. And I'll follow the pattern backwards. And then just roughly sketch in my curve. Kind of smoothing it out between the points. Good. Now I'm going to show you problem 3, and then I'll let you work on problem 4. So problem 3, once again, I have to find amplitude, vertical shift, and period. Whenever I'm graphing, those are the 3 things I want to know. Same as before, my amplitude is 6. I have the cosine now, which is going to show up a little bit differently on the graph, but we'll see that in a moment. My vertical shift, once again, I'm still not adding anything, so I'm not going to be shifted vertically. My curve's not going to be shifted vertically. So my vertical shift is 0, because it's really like I'm adding 0. Now my period, the period for the cosine is 2 pi. And so the cosine is going to go through one cycle when 2x equals 2 pi. So to find my period, the change in x that's going to give me a full cycle, I solve for x by dividing both sides by 2. So my period is pi. So when I look at my graph, I'm sorry, I'll let you pause the video just a moment and work on problem 4. Once you do problem 4, I'll show you how to do the graph. Okay. Now that you've found the amplitude, vertical shift, and period of problem 4, amplitude, of course, was 3, because because I have 3 times the cosine. Vertical shift, again, is 0. And my period, I will have 5x equal to 2 pi. So when 5x goes to 2 pi, the cosine will think that it has gone through an entire cycle. Solving for x, I divide by 5. X equals 2 pi over 5, or 2/5 pi. Now I will show you how to graph problem 3, and then let you graph problem 4. So I take my amplitude, vertical shift, and period. I want to go through 2 cycles, so 2 periods. This would be 2 pi, because that would be 2 rotations of the Ferris wheel. 1 rotation would be pi, so I'll have 1 cycle by the time I get to pi. This will be pi over 2. This will be 3 pi over 2. And if I look at my amplitude, I'm going to have to go up to 6. I'll multiply 1 times 6. I'll multiply -1 times 6. So now I'm going to have to go by 2's. And I have the cosine. So if I go to my unit circle, I'll start at 0, x equals 0. And on my unit circle, when x equals 0, cosine is the a value. So cosine starts at 1, goes to 0, goes to -1, goes back to 0, and then ultimately at 1 full circle, 2 pi radians, I go back to cosine equals 1. But since I'm multiplying by 2, that's going to happen when I go to pi. So start off with 0, cosine is 1. 1 times 6 is 6. If I go back to my equation, cosine then goes to 0 at pi over 2, which the cosine, when x is pi over 4, the cosine is going to think that x is pi over 2. So this is 1/4 of a cycle. I go back to 0. At half a cycle, I go to -1. When I multiply that by 6, I get -6. At 3/4 of a cycle, I am back at 0. So when I'm at pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, put this in here, into the equation. 2 times 3 pi over 4 gives me 3 pi over 2, which is 3/4 of a circle. I'm back to 0. And pi, when it's multiplied by 2, gives me 2 pi. And the cosine is going to think I've gone through a full circle. So I've established a pattern. Start at 1, go to 0, -1, 0, 1, or 6, 0, -6, 0, 6. Go back to 0, -6, 0, 1. And I'll follow the same trend in my negative. And roughly sketch in the graph. And I'll finish filling out my negative pi over 2, -3 pi over 2, -2 pi. The big difference here, when I have a number multiplied by the x, that changes the labeling on the x-axis. I have my x-axis, have my y-axis. Changes the labeling here. When I draw 2 complete cycles, I'm always going to have 2 complete cycles here. what changes is the labeling on the x-axis. Okay. That's going to come into play in problem 4. So go ahead and take a look at that now, and then we'll discuss it. Okay, now that you've come back from pausing the video, let's take a look at problem 3. We have our amplitude, we have our period. So once again, I want 2 cycles. So I'm going to take that period, and that's going to be right here, 2 pi over 5. If I multiply that by 2 to get 2 cycles, I have 4 pi over 5. Half of that would be just pi over 5. Pi over 5 plus pi over 5 gives me 2 pi over 5. Add another pi over 5, I get 3 pi over 5. And I'm not going to write it, but this will be pi over 10 because it's half of this. 2 pi over 10, 3 pi over 10, 4 pi over 10, 5 pi over 10, 6 pi over 10, 7 pi over 10. But the important thing is this is a complete cycle, this is a half a cycle, this is a quarter cycle. So if I look at my cosine, again this is cosine, so I look at the cosine, it starts at 1, goes to 0, goes to -1, comes back around to 0. So I will do the same thing with my graph. Once I have once again I have an amplitude of 3. I multiply everything by 3. So I'm going to go up to start at 3. Cosine is 1. I multiply that by 3. When x is 0, cosine is 1. 3 times the cosine is 3. At a quarter cycle, cosine is 0. So I'm back to 0. Then at a half a cycle, cosine is at -1. So I multiply -1 times 3. I get -3. 3/4 of a cycle, I'm back to 0. And then 1 full cycle, I get back to exactly where I started at 0. So I'm back to cosine equals 1, 3 cosine equals 3. I've established a pattern. You can just follow that pattern. And I'm going to extend that pattern into the negative range. And roughly sketch in the curve. I'll show you how to do problem number 5 now. And you'll notice on problem 5, there's already a graph there. We're going to have to ignore that. I can analyze my graph the same way though, or analyze my equation the same way. Amplitude, once again, is 4. So I have 4 for my amplitude because that's what's multiplied by the cosine in this case. Vertical shift, now I'm adding something. So once I calculate my value of the trig function here, the cosine function, I will add 3. I'll always add 3. That shifts it up vertically 3 units. My period, once again, 2x is what's inside the cosine. So when that equals 2 pi, the cosine is going to think it's gone through a full cycle. So if I look for the x that gives me a full cycle, the change in x that gives me a full cycle, divide these both by 2, cancel, the 2's cancel, I get x equals pi. So my period is pi. So I'm going to want to go through a full cycle when I'm at pi. Pi over 2 is going to give me half a cycle. and pi over 4 will be a quarter cycle. 3 pi over 4 will be 3/4 of a cycle. So pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and at the end I'm going to be 4 pi over 2. Same thing on the negative. I'll just call it negative 2 pi instead of 4 pi over 2. So my vertical shift, start off with I'm doing cosine. So cosine would start at 1. I'll multiply 1 times 4, I get 4. I add 3. That's going to take me up to 7. So I'm going to leave this at 8, 2, 4, 6, 8, going by 2's. So I start at x is 0, cosine is 1, 1 times 4 is 4, add 3, I start at 7. If I go through a quarter cycle, cosine is back up to 0, then it goes to negative